Good morning, everyone. So today I'm going to discuss this topic about the relational data model, which is really about the entity relationship diagram. A continuation of our lesson last time, yung naka PowerPoint presentation. Okay, excuse me. So the relational data model. The relational data model represents data in a form of table. The relational model is based on mathematical theory and therefore has a solid theoretical foundation. However, we need only a few simple concepts to describe the relational model, no, as described in our previous topics. So, the three components of a relational data model are the following. First, we have the data structure, then we have the data manipulation, then we have the data integrity. So, what is a data structure? Data structure is a data are organized in the form of tables with rows and columns. So, yung table ang nagsasabi ng structure ng data natin. So, yung isang relation or isang table, yung pinagsamang rows and column, can be called as the data structure. Next, we have the data manipulation. So, data manipulation are operations typically implemented using the SQL or standard query language and used to manipulate data stored in the relations. So, yung data manipulation ay yun yung way kung paano natin i-access or i-store, i-process, or i-access yung lahat ng data using the SQL in our table or relation. Next, we have the data integrity. It is a mechanism included in a model to specify business rules that maintain the integrity of data when manipulated. So, as you can remember, we have discussed business rules that can be gathered or that can be known from the organization. Doon natin sila makukuha na yun yung maging base natin para makapag-create tayo ng data model, di ba? So, yung mechanism na ini-include dun sa data model natin para ma-set yung integrity ng data na minamanipulate in a table is what we call the data integrity. Okay? So I have here a relational data structure, an example of a relational data structure. So basically and simply that is a table. And I have here an employee table. Yeah. So we have here an employee table with 4 columns or 4 field names such as the employee ID, name, department name, position, and rank. So, and it is composed of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 records. So, it's composed of 5 records. So, a relation is named two-dimensional table of data. So, pag sinabi natin relation, it is the table itself. Table is a relation. A relation is a table. Each relation or table consists of named columns and an arbitrary number of unnamed rows. So, ito mga columns, yan yung mga attribute. So, sabi dito, an attribute is a named column of a relation. Each row of a relation corresponds to a record that contains the data attributes or the data values of a single entity. The table above is an example of a relation named employee table, which contains the employee's attributes, yun yung sinabi ko kanina, employee ID, name, department, name, position, and rank. So, yun. Okay. So, we can express the relational data structure of relation by using the notation in which the relation's name is followed by the names of the attributes in that relation. For example, in the employee table, we could have the following notation. Okay, so to represent the table above, so we have here the name of the table, then open and close parenthesis, and sa loob ng open and close parenthesis nun ay nakalagay yung kanyang mga column names or yung attributes ng entity na employee. And they are separated within a comma. So ito yan. So sa isang relational table, we have what we call the relational keys. And last time we have already discussed the two major types of keys, ano? And those are the primary key and the foreign key. So alam na natin yung dalawa na yan. And here we have the composite key, or what we call the composite key. So basically, a composite key is also a primary key, but it contains or it is consists of more than one attribute. Okay? So hindi lang siya iisa. Ano? So as we can see in this example, we have here the employee table and then the department table. So in the employee table, we have the primary key employee ID, and then the other attributes are name, department name, position, and rank. And for the department table, we have here the department name as the primary key and the location as the as an attribute. Okay. So here we can say that employee ID and the department name are both called as the a composite key of those particular tables. So alam naman natin yung primary key at saka yung foreign key. Ano? Napag-usapan na natin yan last time. Okay? So integrity constraints. The relational data model includes several types of constraints. Ito yung napag-aralan na natin, di ba? Yung mga constraints or rules limiting acceptable values and actions whose purpose is to maintain the accuracy and integrity of data in the database. Integrity constraints are a set of rules. It is used to maintain the quality of information. Integrity constraints ensure that the data insertion, updating, and other processes have to be performed so that data integrity is not affected. Thus integrity constraint is used to guard against accidental damage to the database. So kaya meron tayong tinatawag na data or integrity constraints. So four major types of integrity constraints. So we have here the domain constraint, entity integrity constraint, referential integrity constraint, and the key constraint. So what are those? Dito sila isa-isa. Excuse me. The domain constraints. Domain constraints can be defined as the definition of a valid set of values for an attribute. The domain data type includes string, character, integer, time, date, currency, and many more. The value of the attribute must be available in the corresponding domain. Ano? So, yung domain constraint ay nag-identify ng data type ng isang value na i-input natin dun sa isang particular field dun sa table natin. Ano? So, the domain data type includes the following. So, the data type of a particular value na i-input sa ating database sa isang field sa table natin ay maaari maging string, they can be a character, integer, pwedeng time, date, currency, at marami pang iba. Ano? So, yung constraint na yun ay parang uh, nilalagay para or ini-implement sa isang table para hindi makapag-input or makakapag-save ng maling input dun sa table natin. Ano? Like for example, dito sa table na to. Ano? So for example, meron tayo dito column na age. Ano? Ayan. So as you can see in this example, we have here on the fifth record dito sa ID ay 1004, dun sa huling column nun which is para sa age, naglagay ng A. Ano? So using the domain constraint, hindi ito papayagan. Bakit? Kasi po, yung data type ng column or field na age is naka-integer. Ano? So, ibig sabihin, ang tatanggapin lang niya sa table sa database ay numbers, ang value na walang decimal places. So, integer lang siya. Hindi siya tatanggap ng kahit anong character. Ano? Maliban sa integer na walang kaya nga integer kasi wala siyang decimal places. Okay? Number two, we have here the entity integrity constraints. The entity integrity constraints states that the primary key value cannot be null. No? The primary key value is used to identify individual rows in a relation. And if the primary key has a null value, we can identify these rows. A table can contain null value other than the primary key field. So pagdating sa entity integrity constraints, ang pinag-usapan dito ay yung primary key ng isang table. Ano? Like for example, in this one, we have here the employee table, and it has three columns or fields with four records. Ano? And as for the identification of each record in this particular table, we have the employee ID. Ano? And that employee ID will determine every record in that particular table. Ano? Siya yung mag-identify kung sinong employee ang may ganitong amount ng salary. But if that particular employee becomes null, ano? Hindi pwedeng mangyari yun. Ano? Hindi pwedeng maging null ang isang primary key at yun ang ini-employ ng entity integrity constraints. Ano? So, hindi pwede, tatandaan nyo lagi na hindi pwedeng maging null ang isang primary key. Pwede kang mag-input, pwedeng maging null yung ibang fields sa table sa database other than the primary key. Ano? So, that is not allowed. Ano? Because a primary key value is always needed in a particular record sa ating table sa database. Okay? Next, we have the referential integrity constraints. A referential integrity constraint is specified between two tables. No? So, referential integrity ay nangyayari sa pagitan ng dalawang tables. Ano? In the referential integrity constraints, if a foreign key in table 1 refers to the primary key of table 2, then every value of the foreign key in table 1 must be null or be available in table 2. Okay? So, medyo magulo yan. Ano? Ulitin nga natin, basahin natin ulit. In the referential integrity constraints, if the foreign key in table 1, okay, halimbawa, meron daw tayong table 1. So, yung foreign key dito, ito yon, ID number. Kapag ito daw ay primary key ng table 2, ano? Kasi meron tayong table 2 dito sa baba na meron siyang primary key at itong primary key na to ay foreign key dito sa table 1, ano? Then every value of the foreign key in table 1 dito must be null or be available in table 2. So, ibig sabihin, yung lahat ng pwedeng lumitaw dito ay dapat matatagpuan dito. No? Hindi pwede magkaroon ng value dito sa foreign key dito sa table na to na hindi nakikita dito. Like for example, itong 18 na value na to. Hindi ito ini-enforce dito yung tinatawag na referential integrity constraints, ano? Na hindi dapat mag-appear itong 18 na value as the foreign key for this record because that key, that number, that does not exist in the table 2 where it came from. Ano? Ito ay kinukuha lang mula dito papunta dyan. Ano? Para malaman natin kung sinong employee o kung ano ang location ng mga employee na meron dito sa table na ito. Ano? Ito na yung nakalagay. So, having this number 18 here as the value of the foreign key in this particular record of employee number 3, John, with the age of 27, is not allowed. Ano? Is not allowed as the number 18 is not defined as a primary key of the table 2. And in table 1, the number is a foreign key defined. Ano? Alam na natin kaya dahil siya tinawag na foreign key kasi meron siyang pinanggalingan. Galing siya sa ibang table. Okay? So, kung hindi siya nag-i-exist dun sa table na yun, yan, ini-impose dun yung tinatawag na referential integrity constraint. Okay? So, that's it. Next one, we have the key constraints. Keys are the entity set that is used to identify an entity within its entity set uniquely. Okay? An entity set can have multiple keys, but one key will be the primary key. A primary key can contain a unique and a null value in a relational table. Kulang ito. Yun ay, a primary key can contain a unique value and can't contain a null value in a relational table. So meron po typographical dito, kulang, and cannot contain. Yun. So sa key constraint ang pinag-usapan, ito naman ay sa primary key na naman. So sabi diyan, kailangan siya ay unique. Pinag-usapan kanina, null, it cannot be null. Ngayon, should be unique. So, as for this example, naulit yung dalawang primary key na 1002. So, ini-imply dito yung key constraints because we are talking about primary key that cannot be redundant or dapat walang nauulit, walang kapareho. Dapat siya ay unique. Kung ang value ng isang field mo ay merong or maaaring na papaulit-ulit at merong kapareho, that cannot be called as a primary key. Okay? So that's it. So those are the four integrity constraints. So we have ulit sila? We have the domain constraints, entity integrity constraints, referential integrity constraints, and the key constraints. Okay, now we have here the entity relationship diagram. So an ERD shows the relationships of entity set stored in a database. An entity in this context is an object of a component of data. An entity set is a collection of similar entities. These entities can have attributes that define their properties. By defining the entities, their attributes, and showing the relationship between them, an ER diagram illustrates the logical structure of a database. So, pag sinabing logical structure, ERD yun. Logical structure ng isang database, yun yung ERD. So, ER diagrams are used to sketch out the design of a database. So, kailangang nauunang mangyaring magkaroon or magkapag-develop ng ERD bago i-create ang isang database. The perception of the real world consists of a collection of basic objects called entities and relationships among entity sets. It is used to represent data objects visually. So we have here what we call the entity type. Entity types. So we have here two types of entity, and it can be said as the strong entity and the weak entity. Okay? So an entity type defines a collection or set of entities that have the same attributes. Entities are the instance of people, place, things, or events that are of interest. So entity types are named after the entities that belong to a set of interest. So for example, we have student, we have invoice, invoice line, and product. Sabi natin, we have the two types of entity, and these are the following. We have the strong entity. This entity is the one whose existence does not depend on any other entity in a schema. A single rectangle denotes it. So, kapag single rectangle ang nakikita natin dun sa design or sa illustration ng ating entity, yun ay strong entity. At siya ay mag-i-exist nang hindi nakadepende dun sa ibang entity. So, ibig sabihin, kahit wala yung ibang entity, pwede pa rin siya mag-exist. So, yun. Strong entity always has the primary key in the set of attributes that describes the strong entity. It indicates that each entity in a strong entity set can be uniquely identified. So, yun. Strong entity. Lagi siyang mayroong primary key. Okay? And the weak entity compared to that one is the one that depends on its owner entity. So, a strong entity for its existence. So, itong weak entity ay hindi pwedeng mag-exist sa isang diagram or hindi maging isang table sa isang database na hindi siya nagdedepende sa ibang table. Ano? Doon sa mga strong entity na tinatawag. The double rectangle denotes a weak entity. So, kapag nakakita kayo ng double rectangle sa inyong diagram, those are what we call the weak entities. Excuse po. Weak entities do not have a primary key. Instead, they have a partial key that uniquely discriminates. The primary key of the weak entity is a composite key formed from the primary key of the strong entity and the partial key of the weak entity. The collection of similar weak entities is called weak entity set. The relationship between a weak entity and a strong entity is always denoted with an identifying relationship double diamond. No? So, hindi lang double rectangle yung sa weak entity, pero yung relationship din ng isang strong sa weak entity ay dinidenote din ng isang double diamond. Now, let's see the basis for comparison of the strong and weak entity in the following example. So, for strong entity, kung paano natin ma-identify, basic comparison, the strong entity has a primary key, while the weak entity has a partial discriminator key only. Yun yung pinagsamang primary key ng strong entity at yung partial discriminator key niya. The next one we have that depends. The strong entity is independent of any other entity in a schema. So, pwede siyang mag-exist kahit wala yung ibang entity. And then, a weak entity depends on the strong entity for its existence. So, ibig sabihin, yung isang entity na yun ay hindi mag-exist kapag wala yung isang strong entity. So, that is the weak entity. Denoted. A single rectangle denotes the strong entity. And then, the weak is denoted by a double rectangle. Samantalang sa relation naman, single diamond denotes a relation between two strong entities. And then, kapag strong and weak entity naman ang merong relationship, yun ay denoted ng double diamond. Pagdating sa participation, a strong entity may or may not have potential participation in the relationship. And a weak entity always has total participation in identifying relationships shown by a double line. Okay, so let us see on the following example. So we have here two types of entity. And we have the customer as the strong entity and the loan as the weak entity. So as you can see in the diagram, the loan is denoted by a double rectangle and their relationship was denoted also by a double diamond. Nagpapakita na meron ng weak entity dun sa ating ERD. So kung papansin nyo dito, the customer has its primary key. And this one is denoted by the underline. Yung isa naka-underline. Samantalang, yung loan, wala siyang primary key. Meron lang siyang tinatawag na partial discriminator key. Ito yun. And for the relationship na meron sila, yan, we have here the double lines na nakikita ninyo dito. So the customer is a powerful entity since it may not have a total participation in a relationship. The loan is the weak entity. The entity loan will not have its existence if the customer entity is not present. Kumbaga sa real world o sa totoong mga pangyayari, mag-exist pa rin yung mga customer kahit wala silang loan. Pero yung loan, hindi mag-exist kapag walang mga customer. Yun nga. Kasi Yun. Weak entity at nagdidepende yung loan, magkakaroon ng record ang isang